I know these are very kind of existential questions, but what motivates Israel to be irrational, right? Because if in the United States, it's the lobby, right? So what makes Israel do things that are so not only morally reprehensible, but as you're arguing, not good for Israel in the long run?
Well, I'm not sure I would argue that Israel is irrational. I think that their policies are wrong-headed, but you want to remember that whether a policy is moral or
Right.
not, and I abhor what the Israelis are doing. I've been arguing for a long, long time that this is a genocide, and I am super critical of the Israelis. But whether a policy is moral or not is very different from whether it's rational or not. The question you have to ask yourself is, what are the Israeli goals here? What are they trying to do? And if you go back, to the early 1900s, when the first, second, third aliyahs came from Europe to Israel, or what was then Palestine, and you ask yourself, what did they intend to do? What they wanted to do was create a Jewish state. And they wanted to create a Jewish state that controlled a lot of territory. Some wanted to control more territory than others, but they had grand ambitions. They were not talking about creating a tiny state, but they understood that they couldn't do this all at once. And the end result is that over time, the size of Israel has grown incrementally. They, in 1948, got a rather small state, which was then significantly expanded in 1967 when they got what are called the occupied territories, which is Gaza and the West Bank. And as we all know, those are only temporarily occupied territories. The Israelis have every intention of making the occupied territories part of Greater Israel. And now, if you look at what the Israelis are doing in Lebanon, southern Lebanon, that is, and in Syria, southern Syria, that is, you can see that they're interested in Lebensraum. They want more living room. They want that greater Israel to be even bigger than just Green Line Israel uh, and the West Bank and Gaza Strip. They want to go beyond that. And I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, they try to take territory in the Sinai and maybe territory in what's now Jordan. You do not want to underestimate their appetite. And the Israelis have never said, these are our borders. We have fixed borders, and that's the end of the game. The Israelis are interested in creating a much larger state than they now have. So that's point one. Point two is, at the very most, they want the population to be comprised of 20% Palestinians. This was the number that David Ben-Gurion used to use. He said the state had to be 80% Jewish, 20% non-Jewish. Uh,
Ben-Gurion, one of the leftist leaders of Israel.
yes.
Worth noting, yeah.
Yes, for sure. Or at least a centrist.
Right, yeah. But
Uh,
nominally, right? Part of labor. I mean, it's just funny that this is in Israel that you still get to be called, like, the left and say that you want 20% maximum Palestinians.
if we could just get off on a, a sidetrack here. When I first started studying Israel and how it worked, I tended to think that people like Ben Gurion were moderates, and people like Menachem Begin, who was, one might say, a mortal foe of Ben Gurion's, they were the bad guys. Ben Gurion and people of his ilk were basically liberal Zionists. They were the good guys. And it was people like Begin who were the bad guys. And I came to believe with the passage of time that there really wasn't much difference in what their goals were. It's just that Ben Gurion was very good at uh, covering up with soft language the harsh realities of what Israel was doing and wanted to do. And Begin was more of what I call a Texas Chainsaw Massacre kind of guy. He'd tell you exactly what he was doing. And the more time went on, the more I came to appreciate Begin. his basic honesty.
Right.
Um, and this revolves around the 1967 war. Uh, the argument that people like Michael Oren and so-called liberal Zionists like to make is that in 1967, the Arab countries were about to attack Israel and destroy it. And by some miracle, the Israelis beat them to the punch. It was a preemptive strike, and they won this stunning and unexpected victory. That's the conventional wisdom. It bears little resemblance to the truth. And I remember when Menachem Begin said, let's be honest about this. It was a war of choice. We didn't have to
Yeah.
fight this war. Begin understood full well that Israel was Godzilla going up against Bambi or a series of Bambis. And that's why, of course, the Israelis won this great victory, great set of victories in 1967. But Begin was a straight shooter. You
Right.
don't have to like what he said, but
Yeah.
he told it like it is.
It can be helpful. It
It
can
can be
be
very yeah,
helpful. Yeah.
yeah, it can be very clarifying, and that was not true of people like David Ben-Gurion, I believe.
Right.
One could argue that Ben-Gurion was what Israel needed. He was more sophisticated, he understood the importance of soft power,
Right.
and so forth and so on. But anyway, first point I wanna make to you is that Israel was interested in creating lots of Lebensraum. Second point is they did not want many, if any, Palestinians inside of Greater Israel. I think 80% was the number of Jews that Ben Gurion aimed for, but in an ideal world, it would be an all Jewish state. Uh, Third point you want to keep in mind is that even if you create a Greater Israel that occupies a lot of territory and has a lot of military might, you want to make sure that your neighbors are especially weak. So from the beginning, the Israelis have had a deep seated interest in breaking apart their neighbors. And you see this today in Syria. And by the way, if you go back to the famous or infamous clean break study of the mid 1990s, that was done by Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and others
The
for the
neocon.
Netanyahu government. Yes, by the neocons, right? Syria was the first target of that strategy. And of course, they're trying now to do the same thing with Iran. They want to break these states apart. They want to create dysfunctional rump states on their border. And then the fourth strand of the strategy is they want to have a great power that backs them to the hilt. And of course, today that is the United States. So the lobby works overtime here in the United States, and the Israelis themselves work overtime to keep the United States on Israel's side. And you want to understand, getting back to my first three sets of points, that if you have that kind of ambitious agenda, you're creating Lebensraum, you're wrecking your neighbors, you're trying to push all the Palestinians out, you really need a great power to help you. And this is why the United States is so important to Israel today. And of course, Israel's supporters understand that, if not explicitly, intuitively. They understand that Israel needs the United States, not simply to survive, but it needs the United States to pursue this ambitious agenda.
What you're saying basically is, or I will say this because I don't want people to take anything out of context, but a policy can be rational and genocidal, right? Because morality has nothing to do with rationality, with reason. So if the goal is ethnic cleansing and genocide, then being genocidal is not irrational.
That's correct. I
But
mean,
you're also
I think,
yeah,
and just very quickly, I think people find that very hard to accept.
yeah,
When you say that genocidal policy can be rational, people recoil at that argument. But for analytical purposes, what is going on here is that you separate rationality from morality, right? Because rationality here is basically instrumental rationality. It's how you go about achieving your goals. It's not
right,
the goal
exactly.
itself. So if your goal is to, in effect, drive all the Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank, and you have to pursue a genocidal policy to do that, one can argue, as I certainly would, that that is morally bankrupt in the extreme.
Right.
It violates international law, it violates basic human precepts, and so forth and so on. But you can make the argument that it is rational given what the goal is and what the Israelis are doing. Again, that's not to justify it, just to
Of
say
course.
that it's not irrational. And by the way, I think the classic case here is Hitler.
I was
Uh,
just gonna ask you about that. Yeah, please, yeah.
I teach a lot about World War II, the 1930s, and I talk to a lot about Hitler. I've written a lot about Hitler. One of the reasons that Hitler was so dangerous and so difficult to deal with was that he was, in many ways, a first class strategic thinker. He was no Dummkopf. He was very clever, and therefore he was very dangerous. Now, am I defending Adolf Hitler and saying that he was a good guy and what he was doing made sense and so forth and so on? Of course not. But I'm just saying it's important to understand that even though he was immoral to the in the extreme, right? We're talking about Hitler here. The fact is that as a strategist, as someone who was making calculations about how to achieve his goals, he was very, very good. And that's what made him so difficult to deal with. If you look at what he did between 1933 and really 1941 when he invaded the Soviet Union, that was his fatal mistake. On June 22nd, 1941, he invaded the Soviet Union, and thank God that's what led uh, to his demise. But up until June 22nd, 1941, he had one success after another. He looked like a remarkably skillful strategist, and many people have said that if he had, been hit by a car on June 21st, 1941, he would be celebrated as one of the great strategists, one of the great military and diplomatic strategists of all time. I don't know if I'd go that far, but you get what I'm saying here.
Right.
So my bottom line here is because I'm saying some state or some state's person is rational, that's not to say that that person is moral.